Oh no, it wasn't.
What can you remember about the Blitz, Mum?
Oh, it was honestly very, very vividly.
Yeah,
the night before our house was bombed.
Yeah.
We were evacuated. We were told to get down into the underground shelter because there were, we could hear the planes going over, and they were bombing the shipyards then. On the actual.
So where were you? What was your?
We were in our house.
No, but what was that area called?
Knightswood.
Knightswood, yeah.
So they were flying over Knightswood, but Knightswood on a plane going in a straight line was very near Clydebank, where the ships were. So it would be less than a mile on the air into Clydebank, where they were dropping the bombs for the ship. They were wanting to bomb the ships, and where all the wood was stored to build machines and things. They'd bombed that the night before as well. They'd been there the night before bombing, but they didn't bomb the actual houses till the next night. And the next night we got the first bombs as they came in, and then that was a direct hit in our house. Grandpa was down, and Grandpa wasn't in the house. He'd gone down to get everything ready for us to come to the underground shelter. And Granny was expecting a baby at the time, and there was a baby in the house, and we were all freezing cold. It was March, very
It's
cold.
quite a good programme about
so
that.
what can just asking Mum, what can you remember? Literally sort of second by second about it. Can you remember?
Right, okay. So when the house was actually hit,
Yeah.
When the house was actually hit, it was hit at the front of the house, and I was in that front room, but not at the window, at the very back wall. And my uncle Tom had to do night shift work in a factory. It was compulsory for people who were not in the army to do whole night shifts in factories. And he had already come into my room, knelt down at the bottom of my bed. I started to cry, and then the bomb came in. The bomb hit the house, and all the windows came in, and Tom, the baby, Billy, was over at the window. His cot was over at the window. And he was killed outright. Billy was. So then we were underneath the house, crying and shouting for help. The whole house come down, on top of the family underneath, the Gillicks they were called. And we were down, the house came down, and then I was one of the first to get lifted out. Aunt Jean was screaming. She was a baby, a year and 2 months.
And how old were you? You were 6?
I was 5.5.
Yeah.
Nearly 6. So it was March. I'd have been 6 in June. So I was a good bit, 5 and a bit. Uncle Peter was quite badly hit. His face was down, a piece of sharpener on his face and things. And he was just like this. And the first person, they took me into the ambulance. Then they brought the stretcher with Billy. Then Uncle Jack was brought in, and he'd sharpener in his face, Uncle Jack. And his eye was bleeding, and he was in a terrible state with blood all over his head and everything. Uncle Jack, he would be about 3. He was screaming and shouting. Uncle Peter couldn't speak, couldn't do anything. He was just in shock all the time. And Billy was on the floor, and I kept shouting at Uncle Jack, to shut up. Look at Billy, he's worse than you, and he's not saying a word. I didn't know he was dead.
Yeah.
He was absolutely, his whole body was covered in blood, and he was dead. So anyway, we got into there, and then Uncle Peter came in, Uncle Jack came in, Billy was on the floor, and then there was Aunt Jean was the baby. So they brought the baby in, and the baby was screaming all the time, but I didn't recognise her because she was completely black with soot and everything all over her. She was just a baby, and she had a nappy fallen off, and everything. She was in a terrible state. Anyway, then we were taken to the school, and we were put on the ground, it was a gymnasium, and we were mattresses on the floor, and we were put there, and then we were all tied by the wrist, and I was told not to let anybody come off the mattress, So on that mattress was Uncle Peter, who never spoke for, I would say weeks. He didn't speak, he couldn't speak, Peter. And then Billy was dead, of course. He'd gone to that was it. When my uncles came down from Eaglesham to try and find some of us, all my father's people lived in Eaglesham. The one person that they found was Billy at the city mortuary. So they thought, well, if Billy's in the city mortuary, might be a few others in the city mortuary, But they couldn't find anybody else in the city mortuary. And then they couldn't find us. 8 days we were on that floor of a gymnasium waiting for somebody to come and identify us. We would be sitting going, who's that? People were, we couldn't understand why people didn't come and take us out, Every day we were looking. And then I had stitches, and they shaved my hair, which I was very angry about, and they put some stitches in the top of my head. And I didn't know the man that was putting the stitches in was like, you know, maybe a man that had done a wee bit of medical work before, but he didn't know what to do with this, you know. But I was very upset because my hair was shaved off and had stitches in there. And then I had to go back onto the mat, and we were all tied by the wrist. And Aunt Jean was a baby who kept crawling away from everything, you know. And that was it. And then Granny, at one point, Granny came out in a stretcher, and she said cheerio to us to be good. And she was taken away to some hospital. Her spine was broken, and the baby was already out of her. Uncle Tom was already come out. Uncle Tom was deaf, so obviously
blasted.
Yeah. The thing is, it was a very funny wee boy. It used to come up to your face, and right up to you, like that, to see when
Just
you were
trying
talking.
to hear you.
He was trying to hear you. And we used to make a fun of him. We'd all be doing the same thing. We'd all be going up like that, you know. But he was quite deaf, you know. Anyway,
And what about Grandpa? When did you find him?
We didn't see Grandpa for ages. Well, Grandpa was found 4 days after the bombing of the house. He was found when the fire brigade were going round to pick up valuables of people's houses. So they saw this. What they were arguing. One of them said that guy's boot moved. He was pinned under lots of stuff on top of him, bricks and housing, and apparently somebody saw his boot moving, and this man said, "No, it's not. It's nothing. You're imagining it." And Grandpa was desperately trying to move his boot again. His whole face was blown in, but he could hear the voices, and he heard them saying his boot moved. So Grandpa was trying, but it didn't work. But then they came over, and then they got him out. Then they took him to a hospital in the west of Glasgow, near that big cafe. You know the cafe they used to go. Well, they took him to there, and they wouldn't accept him because his wounds were so bad. His whole face was in and everything, you know, and he was in a terrible state. So then they took him, eventually he went to a military hospital, which was about 200 miles south of Glasgow, where they took him eventually.
Jeez.
It was a military hospital then he was in. So nobody could find him for a while. Nobody could actually find where he was, because all the other hospitals refused to take him. So he was in there. And then when we eventually got to Eaglesham in a condemned, well, I stayed with my grandma in Eaglesham, this Uncle Peter and Uncle Jack were taking us to see Grandpa, me and Peter. And Uncle Peter was a grave digger. He was a lovely man, but he was a wee bit thick. And he had a lemonade bottle, and he had 3 handkerchiefs. And he got this lemonade bottle. Me and him were sitting in the back of the car. I couldn't remember being in a car before that. And he got these big white handkerchiefs, and he wrapped them around the bottles. And I said, "Well, what are you doing that for?" And he said, "Oh, this is what bandages do." And that, you know, and your dad might have a few bandages. And he'd already seen my dad.
Yeah.
My dad was covered from head to foot in bandages. And the only recognition was his voice. I knew his voice. But when we get into the ward to see him, most of the people in that ward had been blown up at sea.
Yeah.
They were young fellas.
So was this down in England nearly? Or?
Oh, it was nearly in England. It was right down the very south of Scotland. Way down south of Dumfries. It was right away. That's where they ended up. That was where the military. He was with the military, although he wasn't. My dad wasn't in the military because his injuries were so extensive. That's why he was down in that area. So he was 2.5 years in hospital. Dad. And they were patching up faces and things and all the rest of it. But anyway, I recognised his voice. Peter didn't recognise him at all. He wanted to run out. He was frightened in the face. Peter was very frightened all the time, you know. And I didn't I just recognised his voice. When as soon as he started to speak, it was like a mummy. You know, it was bandages all over him. But when he said, "Is that my best girl?" or something like that, you know. And I recognised the voice, and I was terribly, terribly pleased to know that was him. But we weren't allowed to stay in